Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's virtual program, One Person, One Vote, the People versus the Electoral College. Today we have the distinct honor and privilege of welcoming Jesse Wegman, a New York Times editorial board member and author of the new book, Let the People Pick the President, where he will be in conversation with investigative reporter Andrew Gumbel about the subject of the history and the complications of the Electoral College and its impact on American democracy. Before we get to tonight's program, I just want to share a little bit about who we are and what we do here at Brooklyn Historical Society. My name is Bo Mendez. I'm the manager of programs and digital communications here at BHS. And like so many other institutions across the nation, we are welcoming you instead of to our usual space, kind of into our hearts and homes of those who are invested in this institution and work to present its mission. We are a 150-year-old institution dedicated to celebrating and preserving the history of Brooklyn, and we are also a dedicated programming center that provides thought-provoking conversations on the subjects of history, politics, culture, and civic dialogue, like the program we're going to have tonight. I'd just like to share a little bit about some things that we have coming down the pike. We have been lucky that we've been able to pivot to providing virtual programs and welcoming people to conversations that are taking place in an online space. We do look forward to welcoming you back to our physical locations in Brooklyn Heights and in Dumbo, but until then, we hope to continue seeing you join us for these conversations online. Next week, we are very excited to welcome back Masha Gessen. They will be presenting their recently released book, Surviving Autocracy, a very powerful and timely piece of investigation and rumination on the topic of autocracy. They will be in conversation with humorist and columnist Alexandra Petrie. Also next week, on August 5th, we will be hosting historian and journalist Leslie M.M. Bloom in conversation with Adam Gopnik. They will be discussing Bloom's new book, Fallout, which looks at the history of a cover-up that kept the wider truth of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings from the general public for almost a year. We are very excited to continue putting on programs like these. We look forward to upcoming partnerships with the Ms. Foundation in honor of the 100-year centennial of women's suffrage and other ongoing programs that we have planned for throughout the summer. So if you'd like to learn more information about our programs, please visit us at brooklynhistory.org. A couple of quick notes about tonight's program. We are proud to partner with Brooklyn's own community bookstore for this event, and they will be acting as our bookseller. We've actually just added a link to the chat about how you can learn more about Let the People Pick the President and purchase your copy today. You can check the chat for that information there. And as the conversation unfolds, we will be taking questions. Our speakers will be taking questions from the audience. And if you have a question that you'd like to submit, please submit it via the chat box. That is a box on the lower end of your Zoom screen and controls. I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and we look forward to having you at other virtual programs, and again, when it is safe to do so, back at our public space in Brooklyn Heights or Dumbo. Until then, please look out for each other and take care of each other. Now, without much further ado, I'd like to introduce to you tonight's moderator, Andrew Gumbel. He is a British-born journalist based in Los Angeles who has won awards for his work as an investigative reporter, political columnist, and feature writer. As a young foreign correspondent, he covered the first democratic elections in East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He has since reported on contested or suspect elections in Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, Haiti, and for the past 20 years, the United States. His 2016 book, Down for the Count, Dirty Elections and the Rotten History of Democracy in America, examined the deep history behind the present dysfunction in the US electoral system. And earlier this year, he wrote an essay, When Democracy Becomes Something Else, The Problem of Elections and What to Do About It. He'll be bringing his keen journalistic eye to the subject of higher education in his latest book, which will be out later this summer, Won't Lose This Dream, How an Upstart Urban University Rewrote the Rules of a Broken System. I will introduce him, and then he will bring Jesse on, and I leave the rest of tonight's conversation in their very capable hands. Welcome, Andrew. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, thank you so much, Bo. Welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished author for tonight, Jesse Wegman. Many of you may know his work from the New York Times, where he writes op-eds under his own name, and he also writes under the newspaper's name as a member of the editorial board. He's been with the Times since 2013, and before that he had journalistic career that spanned many high-profile publications, The Atlantic, NPR, he worked for a number of years, Reuters, Newsweek, Daily Beast, long list of distinguished credits. And I have to tell you, I spend a lot of my career talking to lawyers, whether that's because I'm covering a trial or because I'm reading up on legal cases, which you tend to do a lot of when you're looking at voting rights and elections. And there's always an interesting tension between journalists and lawyers, our two professions. I think in some ways we see the world the same way, we dig information the same way. Maybe there's also some parallels in the way we see ourselves, maybe a little grandly sometimes, as being at the service of the truth. And I've certainly caught myself being a wannabe lawyer from time to time. But there's nothing wannabe about Jesse, because he's actually the full package. He went to law school. He's got a law degree from New York University. So he can do both. He can think deeply and fascinatingly about the Constitution, about legal affairs, and he can write beautifully. I'll try not to hold that too much against you, Jesse. But for that reason, he's the ideal author for tonight's book, Let the People Pick the President, the case for abolishing the Electoral College, which looks at this rather strange and definitely unique way of picking a head of state that no other country has seen fit to copy. Not only is it an extremely timely book as we enter this last 100 days of a singularly consequential presidential election campaign, but it's also an elegant and consistently thought-provoking book. I've read around the literature of the Electoral College a few times, in the course of researching my own book and writing about elections generally. And what really struck me is, first of all, how many compelling stories you managed to tell that illuminate the history of the Electoral College in a way that I haven't read anybody else do, and how it was consistently a thought-provoking and an original book, I think, in a lot of ways. So I very much enjoyed reading it. Those of you who've read it already will know what I'm talking about. Those who haven't, I strongly encourage you to pick up a copy by virtual means, either now or when the conversation is over. A lot of the insights and the anecdotes and the stories we'll get to over the next little bit. So you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. But first, I want to kick things off by reading Alexander Hamilton's best Alexander Hamilton, the star of Broadway, among other things, his best explanation of why the Electoral College came into being in the first place. And this is what he wrote in Federalist 68. He said that the college, quote, affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. He also said it's the college's job to vote for, and I quote, some fit person as president. So my first question has to be, what in the world went wrong?
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for that great introduction, and thanks to Bo and to the Brooklyn Historical Society. I'm thrilled to be here, wherever here is these days, for all of us. The Alexander Hamilton quote has been tossed around for more than 200 years now as a justification for why we have an electoral college. When you read my book, as you'll see that he actually, behind the scenes, was freaking out about this system. He writes a private letter to James Wilson, one of the other framers of the Constitution, in late 1789, after the first election for president, but before the presidential electors have cast their ballots. And he basically sees that there is a game that the anti-federalists, who are very upset about how the Constitution got ratified. There was no Bill of Rights yet, and they didn't like George Washington. He could see that they could game the system basically right from the start. And he wrote this letter to Wilson, and he basically said, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, what the hell are we going to do? We have to stop this from happening. I think he called it the machinations of anti-federalist malignity. And he came up with a scheme whereby they were going to try to, he said, throw away a few votes, maybe 7 or 8, in some Federalist-friendly states as the way to make sure that George Washington ended up in the White House and that the anti-federalists didn't use their electoral votes to keep him out, which is what he was afraid of happening. So really from day one, this system has been gamed, it has been undermined, it has been manipulated, and it has not done the thing that even Alexander Hamilton, the grandfather of the explanations for the Electoral College's wisdom, claimed that it would do.
Right. Well, we should be clear as well that when we talk about presidents who get elected who may not be as fit or as qualified as Federalist 68 implies, that, you know, we're not just talking about present company, that there have been a number of times in American history where in the campaign, one candidate or another was deemed to be unfit, not worthy of the office, and quite often won anyway. Let's just, you know, the other thing I take away from your answer is that, you know, we live in an intensely political time where everything is subject to tremendous infighting of all different kinds. And people forget, I think, that this was the case in 1787 when they drew up the Constitution as well. I want you to talk us through a little bit what happened, you know, that summer in Philadelphia when the founders come together to write the Constitution. This was not an era when democracy was common currency. In fact, a lot of the founders were terrified of it, you know, and we can talk about the reasons why. And how to have a president, whether to elect him or to appoint him or some other method, was something that exercised them more than anything else, and actually was the reason why the whole thing went into overtime. Can you talk through what were the fault lines, and why was it so difficult to figure this out, and why should we conclude, if we should conclude, that the Electoral College was this last minute, rather, you know, inelegant compromise?
Well, the answer to the final part of your question is because it was. They literally cobbled this thing together in the last frenzied days of a 4-month-long convention during that hot Philadelphia summer of 1787. I think it was maybe four or five delegates crammed together in a side room of the convention hall. They had been arguing about this one topic all summer long. It was the one that vexed them more than any other. They said this later. And there's an understandable reason for that, which is, you know, this was a country that was born out of a revolution against a tyrant, literally. And so they were extremely anxious about reestablishing a position of national authority over an entire country. They didn't want to just import a new tyrant into their new country. So they thought very long and hard about, how do we choose that leader? How do we choose a leader who is answerable to the people, but not basically hamstrung by all of the cross currents of politics that we know exist? And so they were debating different ways to do it. A lot of the delegates thought Congress should do it, and that was the underlying assumption for several months of the convention, was that Congress was going to choose the president. Some of the delegates, among the most well-known, James Madison and James Wilson, said, no, we cannot do it that way. The president is going to be dependent on Congress, and that destroys the whole concept of separation of powers. Some people thought the governors of the states should do it. James Wilson, as I've mentioned, he's a fascinating character. Nobody really remembers him today, but he was one of the most, if not the most influential framer at the convention. He was a Scottish immigrant, and he had by those days, very advanced and visionary democratic values about that involved equality and participation by the people. And he was the strongest advocate of all for a direct popular vote for president at the convention. He actually won over several of the top framers, including James Madison, Gouverneur Morris, Rufus King. He really made the strong case from the beginning until the end. Obviously, we know today he didn't win. Why didn't he win? Why do we have this strange system that they finally cobbled together at the end of the convention, rather than what James Wilson was promoting at the very beginning, which was a direct vote for president? There's a lot of answers to that question. One of them is the one that I think we are familiar with, which is the realities of the time, which were people didn't travel far from home. Most people stayed very close to their homes. There was no transportation network. There was no communications network, so most people didn't know very much about politicians outside of their local area. And I think the framers were rightly concerned that when you were choosing someone for a national office, you wanted to make sure that the people making that choice really knew something about that figure or the candidates for that office. And so one of the rationales for this system was it wasn't so much, I would say, a fear of democracy. And I think that's something that we often talk about with regard to the framers. And I think I'd just be careful to complicate that a little bit and say, they were fine with democracy. They were fine with citizens voting, citizens at the time being an extremely small subset of the population. But the House of Representatives, which they considered to be the most important and most powerful branch of government, was directly elected. They were fine with that happening. What they were concerned about was national candidates, people who would run for national office like the presidency, not being known to enough people to be chosen wisely. So this system comes into place. The other, big factor that I think we can talk about, you could spend a whole other, talk on this, is slavery, and the role that slavery and the maintenance of slavery and the protection of the interest of the slave states had in every part of the creation of the Constitution. The Constitution itself is threaded through with an acknowledgement of the validity of slavery and the protection of slavery. And obviously, the biggest protections were the 3/5 clause, which is what was built into the creation of our House of Representatives and gave the slave states this, today I think it's pretty safe to say, undeserved extra power in the national legislature because of their slaves, people they held in human bondage. And then also the creation of the Senate itself, which gave all states equal power, no matter their size, no matter how many residents they had who were voters versus, people who were enslaved. Those compromises, which both went in favor of the slave states and some of the smaller states, which also liked the creation of the Senate, of course, those compromises are imported into the Electoral College, because the Electoral College, as it was finally designed, gave states their electoral votes based on how many members of Congress and senators they had. So if a state had extra power in the national legislature because of all its slaves, it also had extra power in the choosing of the president. And this is not just an academic point. It actually led to different outcomes in the presidential elections in the early years of the Republic. I think it's pretty safe to say that Thomas Jefferson won the 1800 election because of the extra votes that the southern states had for their slaves, on behalf of their slaves. And I think that's a really, that's an important point to remember, is that from the very start, the Electoral College has benefited the interests of white supremacy and of racial, and basically highlighted the racial subjugation that was at the heart of this country's founding.
Right, well, I want to get out of the 18th century soon, but I do want to dwell on that point a little longer, because I think it is vital, because if we understand that the Electoral College didn't work in the time when it was created, I think it's easier to get our heads around the idea that it may not work now.
Right.
And you mentioned the 1800 election when Jefferson came to power. As I understand it, historians and political scientists have gone back and weighted how many Electoral College votes he got and how many of those were due to slavery. And the calculation, I think, is that if there hadn't been the 3/5 law, he wouldn't have, not only would he not have come in first, he wouldn't have even come in second.
Right.
And I think Thomas Pickering, who I think served as Secretary of State at some point, called him dismissively the Negro president.
Exactly.
It was not meant as a compliment, and it's certainly not a phrase that was particularly complimentary to the slave population either. But I think it's telling, because I think there was a lot of frustration that, Virginians in particular had an unfair advantage, slaveholders had an unfair advantage. And that as the country became more democratic, Thomas Jefferson was one of the people who pushed that. And later Andrew Jackson, another flawed ambassador for popular democracy. The system continued to be lumbered with this imbalance, which of course led eventually to the Civil War. And a legacy that we're still struggling with very vividly today. What I want to ask is, how apparent was it, and let's get out of the 18th century and a little bit into the 19th. In 1800, there was a meltdown. We may not have time to go into all the reasons why. There was another meltdown in 1824.
Right.
How apparent was it to people at the time that this electoral college system was not working, was working less and less as the country became more democratic? And were there any efforts before the Civil War to do something about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, in fact, throughout American history, there have been, I think we're between 700 and 800 attempts to amend or abolish outright the Electoral College from the Constitution. That number is far greater than for any other provision of the Constitution by a long shot. So I think people understood from very early on that this system was not as advertised. It didn't do anything that anybody wanted it to do, except for the southern states, which very well understood that it gave them basically double power. It gave them the power of their voters, and it gave them the power of their quote unquote property, the slaves that they kept and got extra electoral power for. So they were very protective of it all the way up until the Civil War and after, for reasons that I think are really upsetting and interesting to talk about. But as early as 1816, there were efforts in Congress to abolish the Electoral College outright. And if you read the debates then, you just see fascinating conversations and arguments between the senators and between members of Congress over many of the same things that we're talking about today. One of the things that I think they understood very early on that was so corrosive is what is exactly corrosive about the Electoral College today. And that is what's called the statewide winner-take-all rule. And that rule refers to how a state awards its electors. Here's something that I think most people don't really understand about the Electoral College. Much of what we think of as the Electoral College today is not in the Constitution. The Constitution is actually pretty bare bones about what is required with the Electoral College. It gives states that set number of electors I told you about. Beyond that, it basically says it's up to you, states. You decide how to pick those electors. You decide how to award them to the different candidates. It's your choice. This is explicit in the Constitution. And so one thing that states started doing very early on was this winner-take-all rule. They started giving all of their electors to the winner of the statewide vote, the candidate who won the most votes in their state. This is something else also. They started giving their citizens, their voting eligible voters, the right to vote. And at the beginning, we have no right as citizens to vote for president. I don't think that's another thing people don't realize about our process of choosing a leader, is that American citizens have no right to play any role at all in the election of their president. State lawmakers have total control over how it happens. Today, states, all 50 states, let their citizens vote, and then they base their awarding of electors on how many voted for, who got the most votes in their state. But it doesn't have to be that way. The state lawmakers themselves used to decide it. They used to award electors divided by congressional district, which 2 states still do today. But this winner-take-all rule very quickly became the norm. Thomas Jefferson saw it happening, and he said, he didn't like it, but he said, as long as other states are doing it, we're crazy not to do it. So he convinced the Virginia delegation, he convinced Virginia to adopt the winner-take-all rule. And this winner-take-all rule was so clearly distorting of the actual political leanings of the population. They saw it right away, and James Madison actually called for a constitutional amendment in 1823. This is, barely 30, 40 years after the ratification of the Constitution, calling for the abolition of that winner-take-all rule. He understood how destructive it was even then. And today, we're still arguing about that rule. And so I really think all the way through, you see criticisms, not just by abolitionists in the middle 19th century who understood so well how harmful this was to Black people, who were then still slaves, but by the framers themselves, who said basically, you know what? We didn't know what we were doing in 1787. We were experimenting. No one had ever built a republic on this scale before. They understood as time went on, and James Madison in particular came to see this, that the core value, the essence of a Republican government, small r, Republican government, was that majority rules. And that's the way that every election in this country runs, except for the biggest one of all. So I just think from the beginning all the way through today, you see these efforts, you see the understanding of how the Electoral College distorts majority rule and how it basically erases the voices of millions of Americans, and how many times very, I think, smart, politically savvy people have tried to change it.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that the system works on 2 tracks. One is sort of reality, and the other is a little bit fantasy. You have the Electoral College, which has been, in theory, it's been a nice, straightforward system that people can feel good about, as people argue in its favor. And in reality, it's been pretty much of a white knuckle ride. I mean, one of the things I was really struck by in your book, which I didn't know, was just the probability every given time of the popular vote and the Electoral College vote diverging, as they have a number of times, but it could have happened many, many more. And every time it's like a roll of the dice, where the democracy is really going to happen, or if we're going to find ourselves embarrassed by the outcome. The other thing is, I think, about the Constitution itself, and we've been having this very high-minded conversation for the last few minutes, talking about all the flaws in the Constitution, how the framers themselves knew it. But that's not the reality of how people have perceived it. Right. And, especially, in the wake of the Civil War, there was, a big push to sort of turn constitution worship, almost you could call it, into a national creed of itself, and that the constitution becomes beyond criticism. Therefore, the electoral college becomes beyond criticism because it's in the constitution. And so, you know, you have both had this sort of near crisis with every election, and in certain elections, which we can talk about next, actual crises. Right. And on the other hand, there's been this taboo on really facing the reality of that. Yeah. So tell us a little bit, you know, first of all, your thoughts on those parallel tracks and how it's influenced modern presidential elections. Sure. But also tell us about, you know, the profound impact, before we get to 2000 and 2016, of those elections in the past where the popular vote and the electoral college vote have diverged, and the kind of chaos that it has caused.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting, even just the way you're describing it, which I think is a very natural and instinctive way to describe it. You use the words like crisis when there's a split between the electoral college and the popular vote, or it's a trauma, or it's you know, it's an upheaval, and that it's happened 5 times in American history. The first was in 1824, and the most recent was in 2016. But as you say, it could have happened many more times in between those incidents. But I do think that the language that you use there, and that so many of us use about that, is really telling. Because I think if the electoral college really were built and to do the thing that that our mythology tells us it was built to do, we wouldn't worry about the fact that the popular vote diverged from the electoral vote outcome, right? Because it doesn't matter. The electoral college vote is the one that matters. We're a republic, not a democracy, as people like to say. And I don't think most people who use that phrase actually know what it means, but that's the common retort, right? It's like, of course we don't, of course the electoral college is the way to do it. We're a republic, not a democracy. But of course, the reality is, both throughout American history and today, that everybody instinctively feels that majority rule is the way you choose the winner of an election, right? It's not just angry liberals who've lost twice in the last 20 years. I put on the inside of my book jacket this famous quote: "The Electoral College is a disaster for a democracy." Who said that? Donald Trump, of course. And why did Donald Trump say that? It was because in 2012, on election night 2012, it looked briefly from certain polling like Mitt Romney was going to win the win the popular vote and lose the electoral college to Barack Obama. Donald Trump supported Mitt Romney. He was mad because he thought, how could somebody win more votes and lose the election? And all I can say is, amen. That's exactly the right reaction in a modern representative democracy. Majority rules. So when you say that it's a crisis, you know, if we're really going by the story that we tell ourselves about what the electoral college is and what the Constitution meant for us to do, we would say, no big deal, right? Of course, you know, of course that's how we choose our leader. That's not true. Everybody doesn't, I could count on, you know, 2 hands the number of people who actually in principle defend the electoral college. Everybody wants the person who won the most votes to win. I guarantee you, if a Republican candidate won the popular vote and lost the electoral college, tomorrow the electoral college would be out of the Constitution. Because then both parties would have suffered from it, and it wouldn't look like a partisan divide anymore. Right. So I also want to, I can speak to those other cases in the late 19th century, but I'll stop there because I've said a lot, and if you want to take it in another direction, I'm happy to go.
Well, when you're talking about crisis and reflecting on that word, one of the things that was very striking in the book that I think you come out and say out straight, which is that if the Electoral College hadn't been in the Constitution, you could make a very strong argument that it is in fact unconstitutional, that it doesn't afford equal protection under the law. And we know this in part because in the 1960s, a similar problem that arose in the apportionment of congressional districts went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled about that. Can you tell us about that case? Exactly. And why this phenomenon known as malapportionment is allowed to exist through the Electoral College, but is flatly rejected by the Supreme Court in the early 1960s when it comes to Congress?
So this was, let's call this a predecessor of partisan gerrymandering. This is sort of a cousin of partisan gerrymandering, and malapportionment is the word that was used then. And what it refers to is the extreme discrepancies in sizes of legislative districts, both at the state and the federal level. So state lawmakers traditionally have all the power to draw these lines, right? And of course, they draw them in ways that are self-interested, right? I mean, you don't let the fox guard the hen house, but that's what we do in America for, for reasons that still escape me. So these lawmakers, who particularly in the South were, no surprise, white rural people, would draw districts which gave themselves far greater power proportionally than, say, urban settings that had a much more racially diverse population. So you could see, just for an example, a district with 3,000 residents in a white rural part of Alabama have as much as 30,000 residents in a much more racially diverse part in say near Montgomery or something. And that was happening, actually it was happening all over the country. It was particularly noticeable in the South because it was also on racial lines. And people had been complaining about it for decades. It was increasingly clear as it was happening more and more into the 20th century. It was a way for white politicians and power brokers to maintain their power as the country was changing its demographics, right? So Blacks who are now citizens and who are, at least in theory, allowed to vote, are streaming up to the North and creating a greater population in the North, giving the North more power. You have waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe coming into the Northeast. So the entire demographics of the country are changing, and these particularly Southern lawmakers are freaking out and saying, we need to hold on to our power, the power that we have. So they're drawing these really malapportioned districts. So it goes up eventually to the Supreme Court. And in a series of cases that you're referring to here in the early 1960s, we know these today as the one person, one vote cases. The Supreme Court says this is not constitutional. Everything about the Constitution and the design of America from the very beginning until today points in one direction, which is one person, one vote, which means everybody gets equal power. It's the colloquial term for political equality, meaning that everyone is a political equal. Everyone is equal at the ballot box. And the court applied this rule to both state legislative elections and federal legislative elections. And by the end of the 1960s, the entire country had basically come into line. All the districts had been redrawn. It was a revolution in representative democracy because it shifted political power in ways that actually reflected where people lived and not just, the decisions of some, rural white lawmakers who wanted to keep all the power, hoard all the power for themselves. In that decision, in those series of decisions, the court acknowledges it sort of preemptively, because how could you not acknowledge this? As they're making this argument about one person, one vote, they realize, you know what? The Electoral College very definitely does not adhere to this standard. And that's because of the things we've been talking about, the ways in which it gives people, it gives wildly discrepant power to people depending on where they live. The court, in its case, says there's no way that a man's vote can depend on where he lives. That's the weight of a man's vote cannot depend on where he lives. And yet they knew the Electoral College did just this. And so they in anticipation of that challenge, they address it in one of these opinions. I think it was in the first opinion in Baker v. Carr. The justices say the Electoral College does not actually abide by this rule. And then they say, again, I'm paraphrasing here, there's nothing we can do about it because it's in the Constitution. And what their point was actually a fair one, which is our job is to interpret the Constitution, not to rewrite it. It's Congress's job to rewrite the Constitution. So if you don't like the Electoral College, amend it. And that's what happened. In the late 1960s, there was a push to amend the Electoral College out of the Constitution, riding on the waves of the energy that came out of those one person, one vote rulings and the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, which themselves were revolutionary. And they came closer than any effort of those 700 plus efforts in American history has ever come to succeeding. And it failed in the end. Why did it fail? Because of a group of Southern segregationist senators who filibustered it until it died. So again, the issue of race and the racial subjugation that was inherent in this country's founding carries through in the protection of the Electoral College up and through the 1960s, and I would argue to today.
Right, and I think it's worth pointing out that the lack of equality between voters through the Electoral College system has actually got a lot worse over time. I actually took the. I can tell everybody who's tuning in that Jesse normally lives in New York, in Brooklyn, but right now he's in Vermont, and I took the trouble to look up the relative weighting of the Electoral College in those states. So in Vermont, I think every 200,000 people gets an Electoral College vote. Because there are 3 electors and there are about 600,000 people. In New York State, it's I think 3 times that many people, or at least twice that many people.
Oh,
And I think even the population of Brooklyn alone is 4 times the population of Vermont. So, which raises the question, if you want to have an influence in the next election, would you vote in Vermont or would you go back to New York? Which then raises another question about the Electoral College, which is both Vermont and New York are considered to be safe Democratic seats. Exactly. So does your vote actually matter? Does it matter whether you vote in one state or the other? It's not going to affect the outcome. And we have a system where if you don't live in a swing state, you're effectively a bystander, or at best, you're a financial contributor or a volunteer that works on the campaign. How have people over time grappled with that problem? It used to be that, there wasn't a lot of partisan rancor around the Electoral College. It wasn't really talked about very much. Now it's becoming more partisan. So talk about who gets to vote, whose votes really count, and why is this suddenly a Democrat versus Republican issue when it wasn't before?
It's a great question. And you actually identified the 2 great inequities of the Electoral College in that question. And I'll tease them apart for people because I think they often get conflated. People often cite those discrepancies relating to the size of the states in talking about the Electoral College. So you just, you did a perfect example of New York versus Vermont. I've gone from one of the biggest population states in the country to, I think, literally the smallest or the second smallest. And there is a discrepancy there that benefits Vermont and benefits all small states, which is what we talked about earlier, which is every state gets those 2 electors for their senators. So obviously smaller states get a bigger bump from the Electoral College than the bigger states do. You're in California, you have 55 electoral votes, 53 for your members of the House and 2 for your senators. Wyoming has, or Vermont, let's say, has 3 electoral votes, right? So technically, a Vermont voter or Wyoming voter has close to 4 times as much power in choosing his or her elector as you do in California, or as I used to in New York. That is an offense to one person, one vote. It is an offense to political equality. Absolutely true. I agree with it. I think it's wrong. But, and this is the important part, that inequity actually is much less influential in the ways in which the college distorts the political makeup of the country than the other one, which you have also identified, which is that swing state versus battleground state. Swing state versus safe state difference. That difference, swing states versus safe states, comes entirely from what we spoke about earlier, that statewide winner-take-all rule. That's because when all you have to do is win the most votes in a state to get all of its votes, and if you don't win the most votes in the state, you get none of its votes, that means any state that is outside the realm of competition, meaning nothing any candidate does in that state is going to make a difference in swinging, in changing who gets the most votes in the state, that's considered a safe state. In a state where campaigning actually does make a difference, we call that a swing state. The problem is there are only about 5, at most 10 swing states in any given year. So that means 40 to 45 states, more than 80% of the American people, are essentially ignored every 4 years because they live in states that don't matter to the outcome of the election. They will definitely go Republican or they will definitely vote Democratic. That doesn't mean that there aren't millions of voters of the other party in those states. It just means that because of that winner-take-all rule, those states are basically locked up. And those swing states, those 5 or 10 states, is where both candidates for both political parties direct all of their attention, all of their money, all of their advertising. They pitch policies, and they actually, presidents govern this way too, in the interest of swing states, because they know that's where their bread is buttered, right? So, look at Barack Obama and the auto bailout. Did he really have to bail out the auto industry? There are some arguments for why he might have done it, but one of them is that was the Rust Belt. That included states like Michigan and Ohio, which are crucial battleground states. What that means is the entire country, a country of 330 million people, is basically at the mercy of a few thousand people in a few randomly distributed swing states in America to decide who's going to be president. We saw it most extremely in 2000 and 2016, which was, literally 537 votes in Florida decided the entire national election. And in 2016, it was 77,000 votes in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin that decided the entire election for an election in which 130 million people voted. Now, you asked me also, why is there this partisan, sheen now to the debates over the Electoral College that didn't exist before? You're right, it didn't exist before. Back in the 1960s, that time I talked about when we almost abolished the Electoral College out of the Constitution, it was not a partisan issue. It was not even a big state, small state issue. Here's another misunderstanding people have. People think that the Electoral College protects the small states. It does not, because all small states, with the exception of one, New Hampshire, are safe states. So they are ignored, just like big states, California, New York, Texas. These are all these states are forgotten about by the candidates because they are safe states. So in the late 1960s, there were small states who were on board with eliminating the Electoral College. There were big states on board with eliminating the Electoral College. What blocked it, as I said, was Southern segregationists who were protecting generations of white power in the South. And I think that's really important to remember. It was not a Democratic-Republican breakdown, because at that time, obviously, Democrats were still, the whites in the South were still Democrats, and the Republican and Democratic Party stood for very different things at that time. The reason that it's become partisan today is very simple, which is just that in 2000 and 2016, both times we've had this split between the Electoral College and popular vote. The Republican candidate has won. It didn't have to happen that way. It nearly happened the other way in 2004. But the bottom line is, as I said earlier, if it were to happen in the reverse this time, again, in the future, and the Republican were to win the popular vote and lose the White House, the partisanship would disappear immediately, and we would abolish the Electoral College.
Right, I'm going to ask you just a couple more questions. We've got some great questions coming in from our audience, which I'm going to get to in just a second. I just want to sort of finish a couple of threads here before we move on to some of those questions. One of them is, if you're in the profession of running presidential campaign, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, and you have the choice, not that it is a choice, but let's say the hypothetical choice, you can focus your efforts on 8 or 10 swing states, or you can run a national campaign where every last vote might be crucial. You're going to have to campaign in the big cities. You're going to have to campaign in the countryside. You're going to have to spend a lot more money on flights and personnel and campaign offices around the country. Isn't there a little bit of a dirty secret that the professionals prefer it the way it is because it's just easier to run the campaign?
Wouldn't you think? Here was the fun part. Well, writing the whole book was actually really fun. And I loved learning. I was chastened by how much I didn't know about American history that I should have known, being a law school graduate and a college graduate. But anyway, one of the things, the most fun parts of writing this book is chapter 9, the last chapter of the book, in which I interview many of the people you just mentioned, campaign managers for both Republican and Democratic presidential campaigns over the last 25 years, field directors and ground game coordinators, the people who actually have to figure out, how do you win the presidency, right? And I asked them 2 questions. I said, how did you win or try to win under the system as we have it? And what would you do if it were a national popular vote? And almost to a person, with really one exception, I'll let you buy the book to find out who, by strategists and campaign managers on the left and the right, they all said they would prefer a popular vote election. They all said they would prefer running a popular vote election. And that's because they understood better than any of us do, because this is literally their job. They understood how corrosive it was and how unrepresentative it was to try to win an election the way you have to do it today, which is to spend all of your time in those swing states, right, in Ohio or Florida or whatever it's going to be this year, North Carolina and Arizona and Wisconsin. I mean, they're really it's just arbitrary which the states are. There's nothing special about those states. They just happen to be very closely divided, and therefore a candidate can do something to move a few thousand votes or maybe even just a few hundred votes and win the entire pot. So these campaign managers and the field directors were saying to me, like, it is crazy the way we run the election right now. I hate it, even though, as you suggest, it might be easier in some ways when all you have to do is fly all your charter flights to Columbus or to Palm Beach or wherever you go. They saw that it would be a much more they understood that they would involve more people, more Americans would come out and vote, so you would have greater participation. You would have less political extremism, because when more people participate, you tend to get more moderate results. And you would have greater democratic legitimacy for the leader, because that person would have been chosen by a majority of Americans, or at least a plurality of Americans, rather than what you have today, which is people who can be elected with a minority of the vote. And I think they really understood that firsthand in a way that few of us do. And, you know, some of them had run gubernatorial elections where that's literally what they had to do, right? In a statewide election, you have to go everywhere because every vote counts. They all count the same, and you need the most to win. Those are pretty basic rules for an election. They loved running elections that way because they got to meet everybody. They got to go all over. They had to appeal to different constituencies. And they knew even if they weren't going to win a particular area, say Democrats in the Central Valley in California, they knew that they could lose that area by less. And that could make all the difference in the election. So it was one of the most interesting parts for me of the book, was really seeing where the rubber hits the road. If we were to change our system and switch to a popular vote for president, how would it change campaigning, and how would it change governance by presidents? And I think it's really I think the evidence is quite strong that both would change in a really important way, and in a way that's very beneficial to American democracy.
Right, and I think there's an argument too that for ordinary voters, they might have more investment in the system if they felt that it would make more of a difference. You know, if you're a black voter, Democrat in Alabama,
absolutely,
or if, as you say, you know, if you're a Trump supporter in the Central Valley in California, or by the way in Los Angeles, doesn't matter where you are.
Oh yeah.
You feel that your neighbors are overwhelmingly not in sympathy with you. That makes you feel uneasy. You feel that the political system isn't responsive to you. That frustrates you, and there's a sort of a turnoff effect, right?
You're insulted. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead. And that's directly attributable to the system that we have.
Absolutely, to this winner-take-all rule. It's not just you're insulted twice if you're, say, a Republican in California. Your state is a safe state, so the candidates don't care about it at all. But even if they did, your vote wouldn't matter, because you're going to be outvoted by the Democrats in that state, and you are effectively erased when the real election for president happens on December 18th or 19th, which is the electors' vote, right? All 55 electors in California will vote for the Democratic candidate. 4.5 million Californians voted for Donald Trump in 2016. None of them mattered a whit in December, right? And the same, you can repeat that all over the country for both Democrats and Republicans. Basically, tens of millions of Americans' voices are erased by the current way we elect the president. And no wonder they get, you know, they get dispirited, and they get to, you know, they don't want to participate in a system that doesn't care about their voice. And you look at swing states, swing state turnout is systematically higher than safe state turnout, for the obvious reason that when people know their vote matters and could change the outcome, they're more likely to vote.
Right. No, absolutely. So I'm going to just round this out with two more questions. One of them is kind of a scary question. This is the horror stories scenario. And then I'm not going to finish there. I'm then going to come to sort of some kind of hope that things could improve maybe faster than people might think. So the horror story scenario is this. In 2000, as you said, in Florida, the election ended up being decided by 537 votes, when in fact a full recount never took place. We should note that as well, that the Supreme Court in its wisdom decided that counting the votes was not paramount.
Thanks for making
that. But there was a couple of other things in the majority ruling there that, you know, gave a lot of people pause. This came up in oral argument. Antonin Scalia mentioned this, and then it was in the majority opinion as well. The notion, which is correct factually, that Article 2 does not grant the right of franchise to the voters. It doesn't give you the right to vote. It's up to the states to decide how they pick their electors. By tradition, it's by popular vote. But the possibility was opened up through that ruling that some states someday, in a close election where the state is run by one particular party, might decide, we're going to take back the power and we're going to decide who our electors are. We're actually not going to let the popular vote in our state prevail. Now, that seems fanciful. In 2000, I think the Speaker of the Florida House raised it as a possibility, as a kind of a game of brinkmanship with the state Supreme Court that was in the middle of ruling a million different things in that, you know, drag-out fight that happened for 36 days after Election Day. We now are in a highly degraded political culture where, you know, people are afraid of all kinds of things. And, you know, some maybe with more justification than others. But, you know, let me ask this. You know, we don't know what's going to happen in November, but let's say for the sake of argument, it comes down to Florida again. That Donald Trump is on the verge of defeat. The Floridians have voted for Joe Biden. And then the Florida legislature decides, you know what, forget the popular vote. We're going to give all 25 electors, or 27, however many Florida now has, to Donald Trump, and that's going to hand him the election. He gets another 4 years. How likely do you think that is? And how worried should we be, if it's not this election, that at some future election, something like this might occur?
You know, you're right, and you're right to highlight the election in 2000 and Justice Scalia's reminder to people that the Constitution gives nobody a right to play any role in the election of the president. It is, as I said before, purely you're at the mercy of your state lawmakers. If your state lawmakers want to give you the power to go and vote for president and then use that as the referendum by which they decide how to award their electors, they can do that. If they want to award the electors, if they want to allocate the electors themselves, they can do that. And Justice Scalia was absolutely right about that. And as you rightly note, that was brought up as a real possibility in 2000 because the legislature the state legislature was run by Republicans. The state Supreme Court was led by Democratic appointees. And when it looked like the state Supreme Court might rule in favor of Al Gore on the counting question, the state legislature basically made some noises like, oh yeah, if you do that, we're gonna just take back the electoral votes and give them to George W. Bush. Now, there's a lot, they couldn't have actually done that then because once the method for awarding electors is settled on, you can't change it after the fact. So if election day has come and gone, state lawmakers can't then change the rules of the game after the fact and say, oh, we don't like how the people voted, we're gonna take it back for ourselves. So in that respect, I think you don't have much to worry about. I don't think you're gonna see that. I mean, in theory, a state could see which way the wind is blowing. Say Florida thinks, oh my God, Donald Trump is, I saw a poll the other day that said Donald Trump is down 13 points in Florida to Joe Biden. I think that's probably overstating it, but you know, it doesn't look good for Trump in Florida. Florida's legislature is still solidly Republican. Might they try to change the state law before election day to say, whatever the voters say, we're not listening to them, we're just gonna award our electors according to how we prefer. Yes, they could do that. I don't think they're gonna do that. I think the norm, and I use this term advisedly because norms have been so completely obliterated. I think you said highly degraded politics of the day. That's a nice way of putting it. I think particularly by our current president, the sort of basic, you know, norms survive because people choose to follow them, not because they have to. And this president doesn't choose to follow anything that he doesn't have to. And also he doesn't choose to follow things he does have to. But you know, I think the norms, I do think that more people other than the president of the United States and some of his allies really do feel bound by norms. And I don't think you would see a state outright try to reject what the clear wishes of its electorate would be in a national election. If, say, I'm trying to think of an example here. I guess Florida, let's stick with Florida. If it looked really clear that Joe Biden was going to win more votes in Florida, and the Florida legislature was mad about that, I just don't see them doing it. Here's where I think the real concern comes in is, you know, I wrote this book in a different world. We lived in a different world until about 6 months ago. And no one was counting on a pandemic upending the global order and American democracy and all of this that we've been living through. And I do think that that opens the door for a lot of potential shenanigans around voting. Now, these aren't shenanigans in the sense of Donald Trump is going to postpone the election, which I hear all the time is just not going to happen. He can't postpone the election. But what could happen is that you get lots of problems with the voting booth. You get lots of issues with mail ballots that haven't been returned or that weren't properly counted or that were thrown out, and fights over that. You could see a huge mess in some states that leads to competing final vote counts, right? So there might be different vote counts that are put together by different, you know, the Secretary of State might try to certify one vote count, but the legislature might try to certify a different one. And then you could be in a legitimately bad situation where the state legislature says, you know what, we don't know what's going on here. There's too many unknowns. We're just going to take this back and decide it ourselves because we need to be able to cast our electoral ballots. And, there are constitutionally mandated dates in federal law that, there's both in the Constitution and in federal law, there are dates that are locked in, which you can't violate. So you got to get the votes in. So in theory, I could see that happening. I am praying that it doesn't happen. We're doing all we can at the editorial board to advocate in favor of states having as robust an electoral process in November as possible, meaning giving people as many options as possible, mail balloting by mail, in-person voting that is safe and secure, all of these things, just so that we have as stable and free and accurate an election as possible. But yes, we are in an unprecedented moment, and the possibilities spool out before us, and some of them are indeed frightening.
Right. No, there's the well-known prayer that election administrators like to say on the morning of election day, which is, please, Lord, let it not be close.
Right. Right.
Which I think it addresses what you're talking about.
And that's just one other point, which is that we live in an era of close elections, and so people pay a lot more attention now to the mechanics of how elections happen. People didn't really worry about how we elect the president back in the 40s and 50s, when presidents were winning 49 states or whatever it was, because it didn't really seem to make a difference. Now, where it's, razor thin margins, it makes a difference. And so we really care more about it.
Right. No, very good. So let's come to something a little more optimistic. There's actually one of the questions from our audience asks it better than maybe I could. Which is, can the Electoral College be abolished, or are we stuck with it? And, I know, because I've read your book, that there is actually an ingenious idea that is in train that could not necessarily abolish the college, but could circumvent it. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
And what the chances are of it succeeding?
So the subtitle of my book is The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College, right? And my publishers insisted on that for a very good reason, which is that abolish is a powerful word when people are trying to decide what book to buy in a bookstore. I am certainly would be okay with abolishing the Electoral College, but the method of getting to a popular vote that is the most plausible today and that is furthest along in its development is actually not abolishing the Electoral College. It is, in fact, keeping the Electoral College exactly as it is designed in the Constitution, which is letting the states decide for themselves how to award their votes. It gets back to what we've been talking about over and over again tonight, which is that state winner take all rule. What this ingenious mechanism is, it's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So that's a mouthful, but people who've heard of it know basically what it means, which is it is an agreement among states to award their electoral votes in a different way than they do today. Rather than awarding them to the winner of their state's popular vote, they're awarding them to the winner of the most votes in all 50 states combined, plus the District of Columbia. And when states representing 270 electoral votes, that's the key number, that's the majority that you need to become president. When states representing 270 electoral votes join this agreement, this compact, it kicks into effect, and the president is always the candidate who wins the most votes in the country. What that does is it forces the candidates to in turn seek votes everywhere and try to win the popular vote in the country rather than just in those swing states. That's the whole point of this. The whole point of this was designed about 15 years ago by a computer scientist in Northern California named John Koza. I spend a whole chapter talking about how he came about this idea. He wasn't the first to come up with the basic idea, but he put it all together in a way that nobody else had before. And he started this compact in 2005. There are now 15 states plus DC that have joined it. They represent together 196 electoral votes. Remember that I said it takes 270 to win the presidency. So that means with 74 more electoral votes joining this compact, states representing 74 more electoral votes, the compact takes effect and we elect the president by the popular vote. It is still technically using the Electoral College. It is just using the Electoral College in a different way than states use it today. The Electoral College and states have always used their electors and awarded their electors in a political way, meaning they have political interests. They wanted more power sort of in relation to each other in the national election. So they say, you know what? If we can give all our electors to our preferred candidate, that's a that's going to make our candidate really, happier than if we could just say, nobody's going to care about if we can only give them half our electoral votes or whatever it is that, they would win if it were, say, a proportional system. But if we can give them all, that's what Thomas Jefferson understood back in 1800 when he said, when all the other states are doing it, it's crazy not to do it. And that's why he made Virginia do it. So this is the same kind of insight that John Koza had 200 years later when he said, wait a minute, there is no rule that states can't award their electors however they choose. So let's say award your electors based on the winner of the popular vote in all 50 states. And that's how you get to a popular vote for president. People call it an end run around the Constitution, or they call it a democratic plot. And it just fundamentally misunderstands what this is. This is not just counting the votes of Democrats, or it's not just counting the votes in the blue states. This is counting the votes of all Americans everywhere equally and saying that the candidate who wins the most of those votes becomes president, which is, I think, what we all want in our hearts, whether or not we can admit it on election day.
One of the interesting things about this compact is that it's getting support predominantly from Democrat majority states. I think that's correct. And this comes back to my point about how the question about the Electoral College has become more partisan in a way that is surprising. Why do you think it is that the Democratic states are more in favor of this than Republican
right.
states?
So that's another reason people call it a Democratic plot, because all 15 states plus DC that have ratified or passed this law to join the compact were led by Democrats when they passed it. So I understand the perception there. And here's what I would say about that. The compact was started, John Koza himself is a Democratic activist fundraiser, but he is joined by, and the compact is run by a bipartisan team of people in politics, including a lot of very conservative Republicans, including Trump-supporting Republicans, who all agree on this one basic principle, which is that the president should be the person who wins the most votes in the country, and candidates should be forced to campaign everywhere and not just focus their attention on a few swing states. So just, I think it was yesterday, I was in conversation at a different book event with one of the Republican people working in the consultants to this National Popular Vote Compact. We probably agree on nothing except for this, but we agree really strongly on this. And he's been going around the country and trying to convince Republican lawmakers in Republican-led states to pass this bill. And I think what people may not realize is that there actually is a lot of Republican support for the Popular Vote Compact. In fact, in 2016, there were 3 Republican-led states that were on the verge of passing the compact into law right before Election Day. And when Donald Trump won the Electoral College and didn't win the popular vote, suddenly everybody saw, the partisan colors went up again. Everyone ran to their corners. And it was a big setback, I think, for the compact movement, because it really will in the end depend on the joining of, I think, Republican-led states as well as Democratic states. So, that's going to be a hurdle for this compact to pass, right? I mean, the question asked, is there any hope for abolishing the Electoral College? I think as an amendment, through an amendment right now, I think the answer is no. Not because I don't think, I actually think you could convince the states that it's not in their interest to have the system operate the way it does now, but because that partisan valence is so strong right now, and I just think people, they don't even listen. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I hope that we can sort of disentangle some of the partisan rancor around this and say, wait a minute, nobody likes this system, right? Republicans only like it because it gave them the White House twice in the last 20 years. Donald Trump, as evidenced by Donald Trump's tweet, they hate it the instant it looks like it will go the other way. So I do think that Popular Vote Compact is a really ingenious design, and it really plays on what the design of the Electoral College is in the Constitution. And it's further along than any effort in the last 50 years. So I would say, read my book or go to nationalpopularvote.com. You can read more about it there. And you can learn about how to help it move forward in the states where it is already under consideration by the legislature.
That's great. Well, one thing I want to do is encourage members of the audience. The questions I'm seeing so far are mostly skeptical questions about the Electoral College. If there's anybody out there who likes the Electoral College, wants to defend it, I'd love to hear your defense, and we can throw your defense at Jesse and get a conversation going. Do it quickly though, because we're running out of time. There is another question which I'm intrigued by, because it speaks to some of the distortions within the architecture of the Constitution beyond the Electoral College, but have implications for the Electoral College. The question is, does the capping of the number of representatives in the House play a large role in the distortions we see in the Electoral College? So I think there's sort of two issues here. One is, what are the distortions in the House? And then what are the distortions in the Electoral College, and are they related?
I love this question, and I love it because it is an issue as close to my heart as the Electoral College is. I'll very quickly summarize this. What the questioner is asking is this capping of the number of representatives in the House is at 435 members of the House. Why is it that number? It doesn't have to be that number. It could be any number. It was capped in 1911, or I should say, the last time it was raised was in 1911, more than 100 years ago, when the country was a third the size it is today. It was capped by some of the same social forces that we see defending the Electoral College, which is Southern white politicians who were very concerned about the demographic shifts in the country to the north, giving more power to the north, wanting to freeze their power when it was at its height by locking in the number of representatives. At the time, that was 435. If there were going to be new representatives added after 1911, they were all going to go to the north. The South was going to be losing representatives. The North was going to be gaining them. So we have been stuck at 435 for 109 years now. And what that means in practice is that the House of Representatives is not at all representative of the country as a whole. States, bigger states should have far more representatives than they do today, but they can't because there's only 435, and every state, by the terms of the Constitution, has to have at least one. The smallest states have one representative. So when you cap that number, two things happen. One is what I just said. The bigger states lose out because they don't have as much representation as they should, which they would have if the number were bigger. And two, what's the word I'm looking for? Disadvantage is imported into the Electoral College because those states have fewer electoral votes than they would have if the House were larger. In the book, I quote from I think a mathematician and a statistician who worked together to game out how would the 2000 election have changed if the size of the House were bigger. And they used different numbers. They went, I think, all the way up from 435 by ones, all the way into like the 800s. And they found that once you got, I think, into the high 500s, Al Gore won every time. And that's using everyone voting the same, right? All Americans' votes are still the same. It's just which states have more representatives in Congress and therefore more electoral votes to cast. So it really would have, I think, a concrete impact on presidential election outcomes if we changed the size of the House. I actually wrote an editorial about this a couple years ago, which I loved. If you want to go read it, I think it was called America Needs a Bigger House. And it is an argument for changing the size of the House, expanding the size of the House. In fact, just as a historical aside, because we're at the Historical Society, the First Amendment that we know today was not the First Amendment, it was the Third Amendment. The First Amendment was written by James Madison, and it was intended to tie the size of the House of Representatives directly to the size of the population of the country. So it would have kept growing along with the country, as it did for the first roughly 150 years of the country's life. And it got cut off in 1911, as I said. But if you use James Madison's calculations for that, we would have a House of Representatives with over 11,000 members today. So clearly that's probably too large, but there are many different ways to calculate a good sized House of Representatives. And in that piece, the editorial that I wrote that I mentioned, we came up with a number that we thought was a fairer one. But that it really does get at, and the questioner's question is really excellent because it does get at yet another distortion of representative democracy that is baked into our Constitution. Well, sorry, that one is not baked into the Constitution because we could change that one by federal law tomorrow. It's purely federal law that sets the number of the House, of members of the House. So that one we could change, but it is currently a distortion of representative democracy that we've all lived with for our entire lives.
Right, one more question, which is related a little bit to something that came in from one of the audience, and then I want to expand on it a little bit, which is a question about the Senate, which I think goes to the architecture of the country and whether it's busting apart a little bit at the seams.
Yeah.
One very commonly cited statistic these days is that I think, in a certain number of years, 30% of the country is going to have 70% of the Senate, and
Yep.
most of the big cities and the big populous states are going to relatively lose power,
Yep.
which is, a crisis of representation. You have the problem of capping in the House. And then you have this tantalizing possibility, which people talk about, which may be a kind of, improvised solution and or recipe for partisan warfare, more partisan warfare, which is to add more states.
Yeah.
People talk about the District of Columbia, which would
Yeah.
clearly be a solid blue state. People talk
Yep.
about Puerto Rico, which would probably be a solid blue state, at least as far as we can foresee for the next couple of decades. How do
Yeah.
maybe this is beyond your pay grade, but how can you resolve all of these ways in which the system is busting at the seams without causing the system to turn into complete chaos?
Okay, so here's what I'll say about the Senate. I'll try to make it quick. Forget the Senate. Don't take your eye off the ball. The Senate is essentially unamendable by the Constitution's own terms. You could add states, maybe you could add DC, maybe you could add Puerto Rico, and then Texas will split into 6 states. And then, that's basically just like mutually assured destruction. The Senate is not going to change. And it is true that the Senate is growing increasingly unrepresentative. Now, some people will say, well, of course the Senate is unrepresentative. It was never meant to be representative. The House of Representatives was the people's house. The Senate is essentially the state's house, right? The Senate represents the states. The House represents the people. As I just explained to our last questioner, the House doesn't even represent the people that well anymore. But the Senate really doesn't do a good job. So, remember this, at the time of the founding, when they created the Senate, there was a big fight over the Senate, right? It was one of the biggest fights at the convention. The nationalists were furious about the creation of the Senate. And at the time, the discrepancy between the biggest state and the smallest state was 6-1. Today, it's 70-1. So, imagine what the founders would say today if they saw a Senate where, the biggest state was 70 times bigger than the smallest state. So that is a real problem in terms of the Senate itself as a body, as an institution representing American interests. I don't know what to say about that. There's nothing you can do about the Senate. But this brings me back to a point I made a little while ago about the role of the Senate-based electors in the Electoral College and how influential they are in distorting the outcomes of the presidential election, as opposed to that state winner-take-all rule. It is really the state winner-take-all rule that matters for presidential elections. It is not those extra senators. So while it's absolutely true that I think the number is by 2040, we're going to have 70% of the country represented by 30 senators and vice versa. I think that's disastrous. I think that's its own problem, but it is at least largely confined to the Senate. It is not something that we need to live with, whose effects we need to live with in the Electoral College. We could have a popular vote for president where the president, him or herself, was chosen by, by plebiscite, by the most people in the country, and then the Senate would be this kind of like, arcane institution that was basically stuck in the 18th century. I don't think that's a recipe for a healthy democracy, but I don't have a solution for it right now because the Senate is literally unchangeable by the Constitution's own terms.
Right. Well, thank you so much. My appeal.
I don't mean to end on such a.
No. I was going to say my appeal for defenses of the Electoral College seems to have fallen on deaf ears, and I don't know if that's because there are no defenders out there, or if, Jesse, your extremely eloquent presentation has convinced everybody that there's nothing good about the Electoral College.
I think
in any case,
people already know this in their hearts. I'm just saying out loud what they know.
In any case, I can strongly recommend again that you, whether you do it now through the link at the website, or if you do it on your own time later, pick up Jesse's book. It's a really terrific read. There's a tremendous number of really interesting historical stories, wonderful analysis, great interviews. The section actually on the political professionals and what they have to say is really fascinating, and I won't give away the secret of which one it was who defended the system. It is an intriguing person who ends up defending the system, that much I will say. And on that note, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Bo Mendez and the Brooklyn Historical Society for hosting us. And despite the strangeness of doing this at opposite ends of the country, unable to see the audience, no clapping. I know that I can see from the numbers of participants that the people have been holding on for the last hour and a bit. And I want to thank you, especially Jesse, for a terrific presentation, and wish everybody a very good evening.
Thanks so much for having me.